Amélie Goulet-Boucher is a master's student at Simon Fraser University, and she is going to explore social media and how backcountry recreationists are using it. So over to you, Amélie.
Thank you so much, Joe. Let me just share my screen with everybody. All right. Everybody seeing everything okay?
That's good, Amélie.
Okay, perfect. So Joe, thank you for the introduction. And as you said, I'm going to be looking at the effects of social media, which we've all heard about anecdotally, but how does it actually apply in decision-making in avalanche terrain? So just to start things off, I would like to acknowledge that I am grateful for the opportunity and privilege to study and live on the unceded and rightful lands of the Secwepemc, and Ktunaxa Nations. I would also like to acknowledge all of our supporters at the SARP program, so the Avalanche Research Program at SFU. So to set the stage a little bit, we started off by looking at what we thought users were using for a channel of communication to get avalanche information. So the old traditional word of mouth guidebook, speaking with peers, looking at conditions to make decisions about where to go and what to ski was what we thought was happening in the past. And now we've come at this with the assumption that now there's these kind of new pathway, a new channel of information, which is social media that influences what we think of the conditions and what we think of what we should go ski or ride or snowshoe or ice climb. So the goals and objective of this research were to look at the users, so just to identify who those users on social media were in the winter recreation context only, so looking at avalanche information only. And we looked at skiers, snowshoers, ice climbers, and snowmobilers. And then our second part of this was just to identify what platforms they were using on social media, how they were using it, and how they were sharing and seeking information relating to avalanche terrain or avalanche information. And our hopes out of this was that we could have useful information in terms of what we can do with harnessing that information and how avalanche professionals can use that information in the future. So before starting our research, we looked into different other fields that have looked at social media as an influence or as a tool in their practices. So we looked at tourism literature, which we know is highly influenced by social media. So the power of an image to convey a power of place, and also what makes a person decide where to go on a trip is highly influenced by that user-generated content. And then we also looked at the natural hazard literature in terms of mainly Twitter and Facebook, which are the platforms in, for example, earthquake floods that are used the most often. So these tools are used as an emergency communication tool. So we looked at how it was used for local and timely information distribution, but also as a monitoring tool to see what events are coming in a certain direction. So if there's intense winds or if there's waves, and how people are sharing that information online. And that led us to the last piece of information that we looked into was also the different social media user types. So these types being the socializers, lurkers, actives, sporadics, and debaters. And just to give you a little bit more context on this one, these types are in terms of just social media use in general in the world. So when you are on Facebook or on Instagram, where do you fit in terms of those categories, in terms of participating in, or as the lurker says, just being a bystander and looking at the information. So I'll have a little bit more on that in a bit, but the methods we used for this research, we conducted 26 semi-structured interviews based on the past literature that we looked at, but also looking at the users that we had. So we took a cross-section of winter recreationists, so snowmobilers, ice climbers, snowshoers, and backcountry skiers and snowboarders. And then what we did is just analyze the content, of those interviews and just pulled out the different themes and information that came out of this. So what our sample looked like, so the demographics of our sample, so we had 29% snowmobilers, 33% were skiers and snowboarders, 24% were ice climbers, and 14% were snowshoers. They were spread across BC and Alberta only. We only kept it to Canadians. Also, we did not have anybody identify other than males and female, and it was an even split 50-50 males and females. And then in terms of the user types, which you may be familiar with Anne St. Clair's research from a couple years ago, we found that a lot of the users that participated in this study were of the categories that understand and can use the bulletin beyond the go, no go decision, or not using the bulletins at all. So the C, D, and E categories. And then in terms of the age, we had 30% that were 25 and 34. 35 to 40 years old represented 42%, 45 to 54, 19%, and 55 plus 9%. So maybe I can extrapolate to say maybe it's also a representation of what user groups are out there using the backcountry as well. So in terms of the platforms that we've found in the purpose of winter recreation only, Facebook is still the winner. So those big platforms and those big Facebook groups like Backcountry YYC, South Coast Touring, Alpine Canadian Alpine climbs of the Canadian Rockies are still the winners. Followed really closely by Instagram, and also very widely used was the Min, which we did kind of lump into social media for the purpose of this research. Followed by blogs. Twitter wasn't used so much for winter recreation, but is still a platform that is used to see alerts that are going out there. Strava, followed by YouTube and FatMap. And some of us might be relieved to know that Snapchat and TikTok were not referenced at all. It could have also been because of the age groups. Also of note, this was conducted a little bit earlier in the winter, so I feel that maybe FatMap would have a different ranking if we were to conduct these interviews right now, just given that it has a little bit exploded this winter. So what this looks like in terms of the general social media types that we had in our samples, we obviously had a lot more that were actives, meaning that they are highly engaged on social media, and they look at social media in their regular lives for information, but also for recreation, looking at photos, just trying to engage in conversations, that kind of thing. We had the debaters who are always out to get an opinion and a reaction. So they are also highly engaged. 19% were socializers, so they tend to not engage in debates and things like that, but they will engage in conversations. And then the lurkers was 22%, which was still a pretty high percentage. Those are just most of the people that sit back and look at photos, but don't necessarily engage on social media. So in terms of what that looked like in the results, so we were able to separate the people that were in our sample into two major types of social media users. So there are the sharing types and there are the seeking types. And of each of these, in the sharing types and in the seeking type, there's three subtypes. So in the sharing types, in the pre-trip, there's the conversation starter. And in the post-trip, so after doing their activity, there's the conditions writer and the people that need accolades. And then in the seeking types on the pre-trip, there's the idea generator, motivation seeker type of person. There's the conditions seeker that's looking at those platforms just for conditions report. And then the post-trip, which is the validation seeker on their decision. So what are exactly those types? So in the sharing typology, as it says, it's mainly people sharing information on these platforms. So they will come up with either an idea or have questions that they would like to ask their community. So they'll turn mostly to Facebook, but will sometimes use Instagram as well. And they'll ask questions about gear, about conditions, and try to engage with the community that they are part of, whether it's ice climbing, snowshoeing, snowmobiling. Their goal really is to gather information in order to be making a decision for the most part on where to go or what to do. Their main platforms of choice are definitely Facebook and Instagram, but sometimes Twitter and blogs. And it seems that it's mostly the beginners to intermediate that will be and beginner intermediate in their activity that will turn to these platforms for questioning. And then the second type is the conditions report writer. So there are specific people that will go out there, do their activity, and then turn to the Min, their own social platforms like Facebook, or maybe Facebook groups like Backcountry YYC or South Coast Touring, those kinds of things. And right after they do their activity, they will share information about observation. Their goal is really to let other people know about the conditions they value when they get that information from others. So their goal really is to just share as much information about their day as they can in order to avoid incidents, for example. And yeah, the three platforms of choice are definitely Facebook, Instagram, and the Min. And it applies mainly for skiers, ice climbers, and snowmobilers. It seems that snowshoers will use different platforms or other platforms entirely, mostly blog reports and that kind of thing, to share their information. And then the third one is somebody that needs accolades from their peers. So it's probably one of the most popular groups. That's somebody that'll go out, do their activity, for example, ice climbing, and then they'll come home that night or not even have time to come home, post a photo on social media, Instagram being the platform of choice, but Facebook and some of the Facebook groups also quite popular. Their only goal is to get likes and comments. It's definitely just an oxytocin boost. Can probably push some people to do things for the gram. Mainly applicable to backcountry skiers, ice climbers, a little bit less so on the snowmobilers and snowshoers. And then if we turn to the seeking typology, so the type 1 is the idea generator motivation seeker. So they will turn to platforms like Instagram and Facebook. Looking at photos, it could be something that they do quite unconsciously every single day. They'll come up with an idea of somewhere to go, match that up with the conditions, not necessarily in that order, and then they'll go out and do their activity. Some people, sometimes that'll even trump conditions, what they'll go ski and what they'll go do. Some people also said that it was a good way to understand what people are skiing under what conditions. So, which leads also to the next category, which is the conditions seeker. So this person will turn to platforms like Instagram and Facebook again of choice, and the Min specifically. They'll look at hashtags, geolocation tags, just to see what people are skiing under conditions like when it's considerable and they're not too sure if they can kind of step it out or not. So they'll try to turn to these platforms just to get an understanding of what conditions are like out there. And then essentially they'll use that information to make a decision about where to go, or go or no go sometimes as well. And then the third type is the validation seeker. And this person may be a little less prevalent, and sometimes does this unconsciously. They will turn to platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and the Min specifically, sometimes blog, but a little less so because it's not always very timely. And their goal is after a day out, so they'll do their activity, and after a day out, they'll turn to these platforms just to validate a decision they've made throughout the day. So for example, they turned around on something and they're wondering if they're the only ones that have turned around, that have seen signs of instability, if they've made the right decision that day, or if they got away with something, if they skied something. So they're literally just turning to these platforms to get a validation on their own decision making. Again, these users are a little bit more intermediate to advanced in their decision making and experience in the field. And these will be people that are in all activities except probably snowshoeing. So mostly ice climbers, skiers, snowboarders, and snowmobilers. So in terms of the different types, it's not, people don't tend to be one type and stay in that type. They are obviously, some people will share different types at different times. Like for example, this Min report from last winter that talked about skiing a particular line, but it's a conditions report, but it's also a bit of a need for accolade validation seeker in terms of patting your back about taking something off or having skied something. And we are seeing a lot more of that in the Mins, but also on Facebook groups and on Instagram. So why should we care as an avalanche industry worker or forecaster? What's in it for us? So a couple of things that came out of this research and looking at how people are using these platforms. So it does fill a void of information that people find they can't find on Avalanche Canada, on our forecast, or on Parks Canada's forecast, or even on the Min reports. It does, we all know that our avalanche forecast areas are quite large. So it does fill the local part of that information. So it can be very localized micro terrain. Information can be shared on social media. It allows the user to have access to a terrific amount of information, lots more than you can find on one bulletin that's a snapshot in the morning or in the evening. It's instant information at times. It's also, this came up quite often, but a picture or a video is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes just seeing a photo will give you a lot of information and people value that. It's also very activity specific. So if we think of ice climbers, for example, I know we've definitely made some changes to them in to make it more friendly for ice climbers. But they do still turn to platforms like their alpine climbs of the Canadian Rockies, for example, to know what ice climbs are in, what conditions are like, those kinds of things, and have an exchange with their peers. It can also create some sort of a feedback loop in this kind of wicked learning environment that we don't always have. So the people that are looking for that validation of their decision during the day, so that can help with at least providing them with a little bit of feedback. It uses less jargon and acronyms, so a lot of beginners feel that sometimes just a photo or somebody that speaks in their language gets the message across about what conditions are like a little bit easier. It also creates a sense of trust and self-identification to the poster. So if somebody did it, I can do it too. Um, and then a few comments came up that the Min platform, and I know there's some changes coming, but that was a little clunky to use. So it's not necessarily the platform that people want to turn to for reporting right away or even reading conditions report over their coffee in the morning. And it's also allowing us to have access to international information. So having access to other sources for incident reports, and that gives you information about what happened so that you can probably avoid these kinds of pitfalls in your own decision making in the future. For users where some of these photos, we've all heard it, that it does definitely create more visitors to certain areas. So it can create a certain sense of safety. So more tracks might make you follow tracks, might make you think that there's a lot of skier compaction and that the snowpack is much safer than it is. It can also create a sense of normality in terms of skiing big terrain. If that's always what you're seeing people ski, there's examples out there of some people around Emerald Slide Path, for the people that are new, that are from this area, that bumped into a group of like brand new first day ski tours that went to the top. And that's probably what they have seen. They said that they had heard about this place on social media and that it was kind of their, it created this new sense of normal, of skiing bigger terrain like that is something that everybody does. It also changes our mountain culture. There's a lot of information available out there now, and more available data like that makes you lose a little bit the sense of adventure, and also lose the sense of not just the safety sense, but having to try a couple of times to go for a specific line and understanding the implications of that. It can also help mitigate certain environmental impacts, like knowing that there will be an influx of people on certain glaciers, for example. And then it can also create a floodgate effect to certain areas. So there is a perfect example out here in the Rockies, and I'm not allowed to mention where it is. But earlier in January, these were kind of the conditions that the local people here, and especially a local mountain guide to the Golden region, was out there earlier in January. There's not a soul there, and these people had been skiing there for a couple of years without ever really seeing that many people. Couple days later, there was a few posts on social media, and within a few days, there were hundreds of tracks in the area. And then there was AST courses, and then there was ACMG exams. And some of the examiners had never really been to that area to ski in the first place. And then there were pro skiers, and then there was 3,000 views. So this gives you a little bit of a opening into the field of social media and how it applies to our decision making, but also the implications in the future. And I think we're just opening the door to what else we could look into. But yeah, I could take some questions if there are any.
Great job, Amelie. I think, like, I certainly found that division of users really helpful. We see that other folks have been provoked as well. And Brent, I see the question box is lit up.
Yes, we have a question from the floor from Jim. Go ahead, Jim. Hello, Jim.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Did you find that the numbers and types and proportion of users that responded to your survey in line with the typical number of backcountry users that we see as a whole, or did your survey respondents tend to, or did your survey respondents tend to be more proportionally represented in perhaps C and D type rather than E?
I feel like there's two questions there. So is it representative of the backcountry user? We definitely had more of the D and E's, well, C, D, and E is overall, it depended on activities, I would say, was kind of who was represented. But also, I think there's, in terms of like the actual population of the recreationists out there, we don't have great numbers. That's not something that we can easily, yeah, we can easily estimate. So in that sense, I would like to think that we in the future would have an idea of what the numbers are and if they're representative of those, like what age groups, but also bulletin types kind of people. But I think we also need to look at it from an activity difference. Like the snowshoers definitely tend to relate differently to our bulletins and also to social media than all of the other groups. I don't know if that answered your question.
All right, the next question from the floor is from B. Lazar. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for the great presentation. I was wondering if you had any initial thoughts for avalanche forecast centers and how they might make better use of social media to not only push the public safety information, but also pull information from users.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're still trying to crunch a bit, like how to best use it. I think first of all, it definitely needs to be something to make our educators include in their programs in terms of this is a phenomenon that's also impacting people that are new to this terrain and to awareness of avalanches, and maybe not to follow the traps of looking at social media for that kind of information. So just making people just talk about that more in our education program. That's one thing. In terms of like forecasters on a day-to-day basis, there's just so much information out there that it's really hard to just say, like, you can look at hashtags and try to find as much information as you want and things like that. It is definitely still, yeah, it would still be time consuming. So I think we're still trying to figure out how to best harness all of that information because there is a lot. And in terms of the user perspective, a lot of people are still turning to those platforms because it's not necessarily somebody official giving you the information. It's a peer that you have trust and confidence is, and I think that's why some people are turning to those platforms for that information. So how exactly to best harness that is not, I can't say 100% I have the solution.
Thanks.
Excellent. Next question is from Rupert. Go ahead, Rupert.
Thanks very much for the interesting presentation. For those of us involved in search and rescue, we find social media sites good areas to find out where people may be. We've used imagery from their location to identify where they are and get a feel for their background. And just to validate one of your comments about normalizing areas, giving a sense of false security. There was definitely an incident last year, a double fatality on one of our local peaks where we felt lack of information on the social media site had contributed significantly to people getting into trouble. So yeah, it's super interesting with lots of implications. But my question to you is, I'm on the boomer theme from yesterday. I'm just wondering why the boomers or people in that sort of 55 plus group aren't well represented. What do you think the barriers are to them, and how could we engage them more on the social media platforms?
That's an interesting question. I don't necessarily think that, well, first of all, in our sign up survey to do it, they weren't represented that much in the first place. So I definitely made an effort to include some. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think not all the platforms are used by all the age groups. So that's one thing. They're heavy users of Facebook groups, but not necessarily heavy users of Instagram, for example, they'll use the mins as well, but they tend to not necessarily be the ones posting. In terms of engaging them, maybe it's just engaging more on Facebook or organizations. I'm not sure that I have the exact answer, but they are definitely engaged when it comes to like backcountry YYC, for example, or alpine climbs of the Kenyan Rockies, those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Excellent. Next question from the floor is from Chris Stetham. Go ahead, Chris. Hello, Chris. Looks like you had your hand up for a question. Maybe that was just an error on the button.
I think Chris has got the mute. He's got to unmute.
All right. Looks like maybe Chris just hit the button inadvertently.
Okay, Amélie. Well,
Am I on now?
Yeah, you're
there
on now.
you are, Chris. Go ahead.
Okay, my apologies. I was figuring out how to do this. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. Speaking from the perspective of the senior group, I wonder if you saw much of an ethical debate in your surveys. For example, the floodgate effect. There are those of us, perhaps traditionalists, who think that it's not right to open the floodgates to perhaps uninitiated group of people on a huge terrain feature. Did you see much ethical debate?
Yes and no. Feature wise, not necessarily, as in like, should I post this or not post this? Not necessarily. More in terms of like, should I tag this or not? So most people have definitely commented on not wanting to be too specific. So they'll leave it at Banff National Park or Yoho National Park, but without saying I'm on like whatever feature. You know, they didn't necessarily go that specifically, and that's more where the ethical debate came into play. It was more to just not be too specific, but still posting a big feature, for example. That was not part of the debate at all. And unfortunately, we also had examples of people that did say that they had people reach out to them about a specific one incident in particular where somebody went and attempted that same line after this particular person posted about it, and one of the people in the party got into an incident and died. And he was talking about it like it wasn't necessarily, obviously it's not his fault because he posted it, but the dilemma of posting it was never part of the discussion. And that happened more than once, where people have commented about posting something and then somebody subsequently getting into an incident.
Thank you.
Brent, I don't see any further questions.
There are no more questions from the floor, Joe.
Oh,
You just got another one here.
spoke too soon.
Yeah, as always. We have a question from Janet. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Hi, great presentation. Thanks very much. It's a pretty well-known phenomenon that women often won't raise their hands or shout accolades in a variety of arenas. I was just wondering if your study looked at gender differences and how social media is being used.
I didn't actually crunch that number like I did interview 50-50 in terms of who were asking more questions. I know it tended to be more males. In terms of posting and all that, I didn't actually look into the details yet of if there's any major differences. Yeah, I understand where that comment is coming from, and it'd be interesting to look at it, but I didn't look at it yet.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
I'm not tempted to rush in because we seem to always get a last minute question. So I'll just hang on a split sec.
I'll say we have no more questions from the floor currently.
Okay, well, I get Brent hath spoken, so that must be the truth. Amelie, I think it was a great presentation, and personally speaking, a lot of social media, it seems to just come as a wave and a big mess that it's really hard to sort out. And I just really found that your, typology, if you want to call it that, kind of helps tease out motivations, and it sounds like a great framework for forecasters everywhere to kind of view how the information is heading into the social sphere. So on behalf of everyone, thanks very much for your work and your presentation today.
Thanks, Joe.